Greetings everyone, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is called Torath Mosheh, Movement, Rebranding, or did I just make all this up? So recently a challenge was made to me, and that was concerning the use of the term Torath Mosheh that I use. It was specifically when I use it in English, because I don't really use the term in Hebrew, and I'll explain why in just a moment. So the points of contention in this challenge that were brought up to me were the following. Is Torath Mosheh a movement? Is my use of the term rebranding? Did I just make all this up? And of course, the answer to all this is no. Now, I must, be clear on this, because in the previous video, I actually gave sources for what I was talking about in terms of, the use of the term. Now, I'm going to explain why I use the term in English, and also why in Hebrew, for example, here in Israel, it isn't something I really even have to use, and I'll dig into that and explain why, for example, it's not a movement. I'm not the leader of a movement, not trying to be a leader of a movement, not trying to start a movement, and there is no need to start a movement because there's no such thing as a movement called Torath Mosheh. Again, I'll explain what all this means, and it's not rebranding. I didn't make it up. So, those who know Judaism outside of the land of Israel, even on some level in the land of Israel, know that there's, if you will, a certain level of conflict that exists between the Orthodox conservative reform and even sometimes the secular, um, you know, Jewish identities, if you will. Now, what often people don't know is that the Orthodox conservative reform movements are essentially, basically, if you will, a conflict that started in Europe. When and I've talked about that issue, the videos, and I won't get into that. Now, one of the things is when I'm dealing with people in English, I usually use the term Torath Mosheh to avoid this whole thing. And one of the other reasons is because of the fact that none of these titles are things that really exist in the Jewish communities of the Middle East, of Asia, of Africa. A person, the only one maybe even close to would be secular. There are some secular Jews who are part of, who are come from families that are from the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. But generally speaking, here in Israel, most of the time you're really dealing with people who keep Torah or people who don't keep Torah. And usually there's not a lot in between. Um, so when I use in English the statement Torath Mosheh, it usually helps me avoid all of this that does exist in the English-speaking world. Now, let's go back to something I defined a long time ago in terms of what the statement Torath Mosheh even means. So a while back I did a video where I expressed the idea that Torath Mosheh is all ancient, authoritative, and authentic historical texts and concepts, judicial rulings, practice, and traditions that trace directly back to the singularity of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai as it was transmitted from Hashem to Moshe ben Amram and all of Am Yisrael, and has been preserved by their descendants who are from the most ancient communities of Mizrahi, Temani, Sfaradi, Maghrabi, and Ashkenazi Jews. Now, to highlight exactly the different elements of what's being discussed here, you see in red ancient, authoritative, and authentic historical texts, concepts, judicial rulings, and practice and traditions. So by this explaining what exactly is meant by the Torath Mosheh that I'm talking about. The next part, in the light blue, that trace directly back to the singularity of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. So this means of where this information would have to come from in order to be considered Torath Mosheh. And then the purple, as it was transmitted from Hashem to Moshe ben Amram, and all of Am Yisrael who has been preserved by their descendants, who are from the most ancient communities as Mizrahi, Temani, Sfaradi, Maghrabi, and Ashkenazi Jews. So this tells you where you would find this information. So concerning this, I've dealt with this in other videos where I've defined what a good source is that something that's ancient, authentic, and authoritative. And this is something that's based on the Tanakh, and also from Chazal, from the rabbis of ancient history. But, specifically, you could find these kind of things in the Tanakh, and I've dealt with that in past videos. So I'm not going to cover too much, right now. But, we'll get into some element of what I'm talking about there. So to give more detail, given that the word Torah means instruction or teaching, etc., and it's derived from the Hebrew root Yud Resh He, and given that the statement Torath Mosheh means instruction, teachings of Moshe, or Moses, as people say in English, and given that Hashem instructed Moshe and gave the Torah to him, meaning written and oral, then of course something that has been passed down through a valid Masorah, a valid transmission, by way of discussion, writing, and teaching Torath Mosheh, can be called a source of Torath Mosheh, or as I often state, a Torath Mosheh source or sources. It doesn't mean though that everything someone teaches comes directly from Mount Sinai, and that's something I've made clear. Some information simply has a basis in Torath Mosheh, and is not exactly Torath Mosheh itself. So this is going to be important going forward in this video of what exactly I mean by some of these statements, and whether or not I'm just making this up or rebranding. So now let's deal with this issue of the accusation of rebranding, and is it true? So what is rebranding? Rebranding, of course, is the creation of a new look and feel for an established product or company. The usual goal of rebranding is to influence a customer's perception about a product or service or the company overall by revitalizing the brand and making it seem more modern and relevant to the customer's needs. Now, this is interesting because if you've noticed, I keep saying the word ancient. So this would be like, if it was rebranding, I wouldn't be talking about something ancient. I'd be talking about what I made up all of a sudden. So that's the question that we face here. Is this something where I've taken something like, that Torath Mosheh means one thing in the past, and I've taken it and made it into something else. So you've seen my description. So now let's go into detail to determine whether or not the accusation that was made is true. So you could even ask, okay, well, what exactly is the purpose here? For what purpose would, for example, I, create this new term, or rebrand it and make it mean something else? Is it to kind of throw people off? Is it to like fool people, to make them confused? And the way I'm going to explain it is that it's in order to not get them lost, confused, unsure, unclear, perplexed, disoriented, or bewildered by what I'm talking about. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the whole Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, all these different terms that deal with something that came out of Europe, out of the Jewish communities of Europe, and the battles they had about whether to keep the Torah or not keep the Torah, and who kept it and who didn't keep it. By using Torath Mosheh, I make it clear of what I'm talking about, and it doesn't confuse people by someone saying Judaism and then saying, well, I have to preface that, and say it's this type of Judaism or that type of Judaism. Well, Torath Mosheh is pretty clear. The other issue is that someone, I think the person making the accusation was trying to say, well, I'm being, false. I'm making up a false scenario here that I'm, creating the, taking the title that meant one thing and making it into something else. So we'll see pretty soon whether that's the case or not. So now let's address what do the sources say. So when we look in the Tanakh, when we look in the book of Joshua, as you call it in English, in Hebrew it's called Yehoshua ben Nun, Perek Het, which is chapter 8. The statement that you see highlighted in yellow, in Hebrew is being read from right to left, says Kakatuv b'Sefer Torath Mosheh. So what that means is as written in the scroll Torath Mosheh. So we see that this has this is one of the first. This is actually the first mention of the statement Torath Mosheh. It's not the first mention of a Torah of Moses, of Torah of Moshe. It's the first mention of the statement Torath Mosheh, the Torah of Moses, or Torah of Moshe. So a little bit later on in Sefer Yoshua ben Nun, it also says Hakatuv b'Sefer Torath Moshe. So again, the scroll of Torah Moshe. So this says that there was a scroll that was written by Moshe Rabbeinu and had the teachings of Moshe Rabbeinu in it. And this is what Hashem, in the statements here, it's dealing with, Yehoshua ben Nun holding by the things that he had been taught from Moshe Rabbeinu, holding by the teachings that were in the Torah scroll of Moshe Rabbeinu. Now later in the Torah, in the Tanakh, in what's in English called 2 Chronicles 23:18. Again, it mentions Kakatuv b'Torath Moshe. So it again mentions the idea of a Torath Moshe, that something was written in it, it was a written text. And further, in 2 Divrei Hayamim 25:4, it again mentions Kakatuv b'Torah b'Sefer Moshe Asher Tzivo Adonai. So here it mentions, like it's written in the Torah, in the scroll, that Moshe Rabbeinu received, as a command from Hashem. So, as we say, the statement itself is a statement that's talking about a Sefer Torah in this one aspect of it. It's talking about an actual written text. Further to this, in the Navi, the prophet Malachi, Perek Gimel, Malachi chapter 3, it says the following: Zichrut Torath Moshe Avdi, Asher Tziviti Oto, B'Chorev Ala Kol Yisrael Chokim Mishpatim. So translated, you could say that the highlighted part is Torath Moshe, and it says that which was commanded to him on Horeb, on Mount Sinai, the Hukim and Mishpatim, which is like statutes and laws, things like that. So essentially what we see here is that this is talking about the things that were commanded to Moshe. Now, what's interesting, and goes back to the point I've been making, is if you look at the commentary Mesudot David on this particular text, he says the following concerning the statement, remember the Torah of my servant Moshe. So he says, our rabbis state, whereas, and to receive the good reward and recompense thus in every generation, remember the Torah which Moshe, Hashem's servant, transmitted to you, because in keeping it, keeping of it, you will receive the reward recompense. So this is what he states in the part there at the very top, where in the middle of this part here, where it says, Zichru Torath Mosheh Avdi Ral Rabbeinu Lamar הואיל ותקבלו ג'מול טוב ולכן בכל דור ודור זכרו התורה שמסרה לכם משה עבדי כי במשמרתו כי תקבלו הג'מול. So essentially what he's saying here, as I mentioned before, is that there is a Torath Mosheh that every generation is supposed to keep. So, again, this is not something I've been rebranding. You mentioned, remember, if I, as I mentioned before, this is not some kind of situation where I've rebranded something. There's a written Torah. That's pretty clear based on what we've read here, and it's something that's supposed to be passed on from generation to generation. So now, if we look in the book called the Kuzari, which is written by Rabbi Yehuda Levi, so he says in the chapter 3 or section 3, like of the Lamed Tet, he says the following. And again, just to give some history on the Kuzari, essentially it's a story that he wrote that kind of deals with a lot of halachic and Torah issues, Tanakh issues, where he has this king that's asking a question to a rabbi after he had this dream, and he asked like the Christians, he asked the Muslims, he asked the philosophers, and then eventually he gets to asking someone who was Jewish. And in the green, at the very top, it says, Torotenu keshura b'halacha leMoshe Sinai, או מן המקום אשר יבחר השם, כי מציון תצא תורה ודבר על השם מירושלים. ועמד השופטים והשוטרים והכהנים וסנהדרין. ואנחנו מצווים שנשמע מהשופט, מהממונות, בכל דור ודור, כמו שאמר או אל השופט, אשר יהיה יבגו. ושמח לו ואמרו, ועשית על פי התורה אשר יורוך לא תסור מן הדבר. So translating what this means is in the green it says, a Torah is connected to the halacha to Moshe from Sinai, from like the halacha Moshe Sinai, or from the place which Hashem will choose, because from Sion comes forth the Torah and the word of Hashem from Yerushalayim, and the standing judges, officers, Kohanim, and the Sanhedrins, meaning the Sanhedrin, the Bet Din Agadol, or the if you will, the Supreme Court of the Torah that existed in Jerusalem. And in the yellow, and we're commanded to hear, observe from the judge who was assigned in every generation, like it states, to the judge which will be, and so on, to adhere to him. And it states, you will do the Torah per the instruction they instruct you, not to turn from the matter. Now, it's important to note, this is saying the exact same things I've been saying, and I mentioned in the very beginning, because it doesn't just say that there's a Torah that, was written in oral, and it only existed way back when. It says also this includes, for the judges, who are in a generation or leading the people of Israel, and that the if you will, the epicenter of the Torah is Yerushalayim, when you have the Sanhedrin, which is made up of the Shoftim, the judges, the Shotorim, the officers, and the Kohanim, and the Sanhedrin. So again, going back to what I wrote, if you look at it, this is not any different than what I've stated here. That we could call these things Torath Mosheh. That this is like the halacha. This is where we go back to. So when when we had a Bet Din Agadol, when we had a Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, it isn't like you decide halacha, just every little person doing their own little thing. If there was a major question that came up, you take it directly through the judicial system, and at some point, the end of the line of the Torah Shabbat Peh and the written Torah is the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim. So we don't have that anymore. But if we hold by the rulings of every one of them that has been recorded, and we hold by what is considered to be halacha, then we're holding by Torath Mosheh. So I asked a question a while back to one of the rabbis I learned from, Rabbi Dr. Ratzon Arusi, concerning halacha leMoshe Sinai. And it was after I had a discussion with someone who was saying tefillin or not halacha leMoshe Sinai. And I wanted to confirm that that first of all that it was, but also that my understanding of what the statement means was correct. So the above, if you can read Hebrew, is my question. And you can pause it here because I also asked about what's called the Divrei Sofrim. And Divrei Sofrim is often used to mean the leaders of any generation who learned or made judicial rulings, for example. So I asked a question about these two issues, about like what things are considered to be directly from Moshe Rabbeinu, meaning Moses himself and his Bet Din, or what things come from the generations of leaders of the Jewish community. So Rabbi Arusi answered in the following way. He says, "The very bottom, יש דברים שנאמרו עליהם באופן כללי עקרוני, שהם הלכה למשה מסיני. ובמקראים כאלה, פרטים אינם הלכה למשה מסיני." So he says that there are things that we call Torath Mosheh Sinai, but the details of those things are not directly like from Moshe, Moshe Rabbeinu. They're not directly halacha leMoshe Sinai. And he says at the very bottom, "V'yesh devarim shehem halacha leMoshe Sinai, hem upratehem." So there are certain things that they are, and the details about them are directly Torath Moshe Sinai. ולכן יש לדקדק היטב תמיד בדברי חז"ל בכל הדבר שנאמר עליו שהוא הלכה למשה מסיני, אם התכוונו גם לפרטים. So he says that there are things, that these same things that we're talking about, that are both in the detail and the mitzvah themselves, are directly, halacha Moshe Sinai, that we have to be very, if you will, not strict, but more like exact about doing them the way that Chazal, the way the rabbis have taught us, because of the fact that this is from a transmission that transmission that directly comes from Moshe Rabbeinu from Mount Sinai. Now, also, he was asked a similar question about halacha Moshe Sinai, about a specific question by someone else. And interestingly here, he also goes a little further into his answer. So when responding to this person's question, he says the following, Zo ena halacha Moshe Sinai. So the person's question, he was saying that the question you asked, what you asked about, is not halacha Moshe Sinai. But he says the following, which is highlighted. Ki halacha Moshe Sinai, hi halacha shekibalnu ממשה, שהיא עקורה מן המקרא, ואילו הלכה זו היא תקנה, שבהיד של משה רבנו, וברשותו תיקנו אותה. So he's saying that, for example, that that when we define what exactly is halakha Moshe Sinai, that what we're talking about is halakha that we received from Moshe Rabbeinu, and that Moshe Rabbeinu, that we get. There are situations that we don't get certain things directly from the text, but that Moshe Rabbeinu made a ruling, and he was given the ability to make that ruling, and it was basically to deal with the current situations, and it was a ruling that was made for future generations also. So the last part he says is v'divrei sofrim hi halacha shechazal manfikim ota min hamikra af al pi achat mi-13 midot shehatorah nidreshet mehen. So he says that this divrei sofrim, the words of the sages of the generations, or the rabbis of their generation, or halacha, that basically Chazal, the rabbis, made themselves from using the principles given in the Torah, in order to make rulings based upon the generations, for example. So those things, are divrei sofrim, are very specific, and there's all halacha Moshe Sinai. So there are things that we received directly from Moshe Rabbeinu, from his bet mishpat, his judicial court that he had, and then there are things we get from the later generations after Moshe Rabbeinu. So one of the things I often do, ask, when I ask these kind of questions, just to kind of get a global perspective. I also, ask it, not from the standpoint of doing something, but more just the standpoint of understanding of how different rabbis understand it, different leaders of different Jewish communities understand it. I also asked a different question to the website kipa.com. So the question I asked was concerning the issue, and I'll just translate it. I won't actually read through the Hebrew right now. Was concerning the statement Torath Mosheh, whether or not, number one could say that Torath Mosheh is the written Torah and the oral Torah. Number two, if one can describe the Masoret, the transmission from generation to generation that has been received through the different communities, that are ancient, like Temanim, Sfaradim, and Mizrachim, and Ashkenazim, whether that could be considered Torath Mosheh. Whether or not, number three, the things that we've learned, that we received from the, our ancestors, from the Sanhedrins, from the different, judicial bodies, as well as the different leaders who descend from them, and all the way to the Achronim, whether those things can also be considered or called Torath Mosheh. And number four, is it possible that in our day and time we have Torath Mosheh? That if we go and learn from a respectable source that has a Masorah, whether we can say that that is also Torath Mosheh. So the response I received from Rabbi Yehuda Levi Amichai says the following. It says, Torath Mosheh, זה שם כולל לדבורים שהתקבלו אצל משה רבנו עליו השלום, ומכוון שתורה שבכתב נתנם למשה והובהרה, על כן היא ודאי כלולה במילים אלו. אבל גם תורה שבעל פה, שנתקבלה על ידי משה רבנו עליו השלום, היא כלולה בתורת משה. So he says exactly what I was saying in the beginning, that the written Torah and the oral Torah are called Torath Mosheh. These are things that were directly from, the received from Hashem to Moshe Rabbeinu. And then he further says, Gam sha'ar davorim efshar lachlil b'Torat Moshe. So he says that there are also some other things, some remaining things that we can call Torat Moshe. He says, but aval, meaning but, ze kavar tului b'hakesher hakriya v'hachtiva. So he says that, but it depends. It depends on its connection to the reading of the text and the written text. So he says, Daenu lema hakatuv hitkaven. אבל המכוון שכל מה שהתלמיד ותיק יכול לחדש כבר ניתן למשה רבנו עליו השלום מסיני. על כן זה יכול להיות כולל בתורת משה רבנו עליו השלום. So he says that there are things that are considered to be in the, if you will, the bag of, different people who've learned Torah, like the students of Torah. That can be also considered, called Torath Mosheh Rabbeinu, especially when they're dealing directly with things that come from Moshe Rabbeinu from Sinai. And he says, concerning that issue, Aval ze hachrechi. So he says, but it isn't a must. For example, he says Tului b'hakeshel hadavarim. So it depends on what the connection is between the things. It depends on what the actual issue is, the connection is. And he further says, Hamusag talmid v'tik hakavana talmid miyuchad sheyadua b'divrei Torato. So he says that the term Talmid Vetik, the intention there is that you have like someone who's learned Torah, from the Torah of, that it's known to him the Torah, so it's like saying he learned it from a respectable source or a trustworthy source, an authentic source. It isn't just someone off the street showing up and saying this is the Torah, and then explaining something that no one's ever heard of before, and also something that he didn't learn himself from some reliable source. Then he says, finishing off, כך שאין הכוונה לכל חידוש שנאמר בבית מדרש אלה גדולי ישראל ראשונים שהם תלמידים ותיקים. So he says that it isn't just like, every little thing that, comes up in a Bet Midrash is that, except for the things that we get from the Yisrael, from the Rishonim of the people of Israel, and that the Talmidim and Vatikim. So he's basically saying that, yes, you can call the things that you've mentioned here, Torath Mosheh, but it just depends on what it is. It depends on what the source of it is. Not everything that is mentioned in the latter ones are Torath Mosheh, but it also is not saying that none of them are. For example. So it's basically saying the same thing I mentioned. So I asked the same questions to the Kav Halacha Hasfaradi, which is a Sephardic site, concerning halacha. And essentially, the response I received there is Teshiva Achat Lekulam. Moshe Rabbeinu kibel hen Torah shebichtav hen baal peh lachen hakol nikra zichru Torat Moshe Abdi. So essentially, what he says here is going back to what was mentioned in Malachi, that you have, he says that the questions I asked, everything there can be, grouped into this area of, one answer. That essentially it's a type of, the remembrance of the Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu, received, from Hashem. That, the written Torah and the oral Torah. So again, what I'm talking about is any source that deals with it, in a halakhic sense and has a Masorah behind it. If it's just something that someone made up one day and doesn't have a Masorah, of course not. It can't be concluded in that. So again, going by the definition I gave here, you'll see that the information I've now presented, is the same exact thing I'm talking about here. I'm very, and that's one thing I try to explain to the person who brought this challenge. I'm very specific in my words, and I would never write something unless I've checked it over several different times. And again, the person doesn't have to believe me, but you've seen here that there are different sources that are saying the exact same thing that I'm mentioning here. And they're not sources I'm making up. This is not a movement. This is something just simply saying that there are Jewish communities in the Mizrach, the Temani communities, Sephardic communities, Maghrebi communities, Ashkenaz communities, who keep the Torah as we received it from Hashem and received it from Moshe Rabbeinu through the generations. So this means that we have the oral Torah sources. So we've had the written, like I mentioned earlier, but we have the oral Torah sources. And I'm only showing a few that I go by. This isn't like all of them, for example. You can go to different Jewish communities and get these sources. We also have Torah-based leaders, to this day, who have taught and, who we learn from. And I've been able to at least learn from some of the rabbis that are shown here, as well as some of the students of some of the rabbis that are shown here who have already passed away. So we have all of the elements of what I mentioned before, which means that Torath Moshe is the things I mentioned. These are the type of people I learn it from. And again, that's why I say I don't just make up stuff willy-nilly. I go and try to check sources that go back to this, and I learn from rabbis who have a connection to the Masorah, and from different Jewish communities, so that way I can have a really expansive view of these things. So in conclusion, a question and a statement. So remember that graphic? Remember the graphic I put in the very beginning? And how I was saying that, by saying Torath Moshe when I'm dealing with people in English, it allows me to evade all of these ideas here, about having to like have someone say, well, you Orthodox do this, and then the conservative this, because I'm not conservative and reform, definitely. The only thing if I had to use a term, I would use the Orthodox Judaism term. But again, saying Torath Moshe allows me to avoid the battle here. And that was the point when I joined this one forum where this issue came up, was to avoid this battle, because one of the things the forum had, and one of the things a person challenged me on, they were saying, well, aren't you just creating another division amongst Judaism? And I was like, well, wait a minute. The forum has an Orthodox directory, a conservative directory, a Reform directory, a Reconstructionist, humanistic. It had a Messianic Jewish. All of these things are being called Judaism. So at some point, if I don't want to be involved in any of the disputes about it, I say Torath Moshe, it's pretty clear what I'm talking about, and only certain types of Jews who keep Torah, the way it was given at Mount Sinai, would ever use such a term. And that's one of the things I avoid by using that term. So again, as we see here, this is the statement. The statement that you see here is not something I made up, and as you can see, I showed the sources about where it is. And again, if I just made it up or rebranded it, we wouldn't find anything close to what I mentioned here. So what this means is that Torath Moshe, using it as a term in English, and in Israel, I'd really have to use this term, because in Israel, generally speaking, you have people who keep Torah or don't keep Torah, and not very much in between. It's pretty easy here when you see someone living a certain lifestyle and dressing a certain way to know that they're holding by the Torah. Whether you agree with it or not is a different story. You can look at them and tell that they are at least keeping the Torah. And even if they make mistakes in it, they're at least keeping the Torah. Where you can look at someone else and say, okay, well, I don't have any idea if they're keeping Torah. It doesn't look like they are. So this is the point that I was trying to make with this. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care.